Good morning, everyone. To people who've seen me talk before at these conferences, today marks a watershed in that this is the first time you'll see me use a PowerPoint presentation. Bear with me, it's not my favourite activity. Just before I kick off, the conference has heard a lot about industry-based training and what people's perception of those things are. I have a regulator's perspective. That means I constitute one of, when you look at these things, I see that if you compare it to sport, there's four perspectives on which the industry can look at. There are the players, the spectators, the coaches, and the referees, if you think about the sporting analogy. Anybody who's played sport and then had to referee it knows it's a completely different activity to try and referee a game you've been playing. Coaches, some players make good coaches, some great players make lousy coaches. But what is key is that everybody has a role and an understanding of what the game actually is. To overemphasise any one group within that, or not to respect everybody's role in it, is a mistake what needs to happen to take yourself forward. There's a thing they do in international hockey. People talk about excellence. They don't apply the strict rules of hockey. The better and more skilled the players are, the referees do what they call the spirit of the game. We play in the spirit of the game. We don't go for technical breaches. We maximise the flow and the spectacle that is the game to ensure the outcome. As a regulator, I spend a surprisingly large amount of time with industry saying, no, I won't. No, I won't regulate you. I won't set a series of prescriptive rules that exclude non-participants. Most people think that we regulators love finding things that we can put rules around. We don't. It's the opposite. We spend much more time saying no to you than we saying yes about increasing the rules. But what I will say about the rules, whether I'm talking about the National Construction Code, the Building Code, AS 3000 or any of its attendant standards, or AS 3500, 5601, any of those things, that's a shout out to gas people, though I know what 5601 is. They are minimum mandatory compliance. They are not, as we have experienced in what you'll see, aspirational targets. We don't see the wiring rules as something that people should aspire to comply with. We see it as the base. And all too frequently, what we're seeing is that it is not a case of people being able to comply with the minimums. And we are fighting fights over whether or not minimum compliance is necessary. So, that's the Royale Solar Farm. It's to the south of Canberra. It's about 800 metres above sea level. It's about 150 metres higher than the rest of the city. Just go through the basics. 83,000 panels, 4,080 arrays, 6.5 kilometres of HV cable. This thing's connected to a zone substation 4.5 kilometres away. There's an underground cable that runs two pairs, 4.5 kilometres through granite and rock on an old fire trail running underneath 132 kVA easement. And he manages to go through some of the most high conservation areas in the city that the territory's got, including some of the last remnant grass varietals that to the untrained eye look like weeds, which to the people using the bulldozers, it looked like weeds to them when there was significant damage got done during the course of that. 6.5 kilometres of cable, 240 above ground junction boxes, 10 power conversion blocks, two weather stations to monitor what's going on in a 50 kilometre radius, 2 switcher metering stations and lightning protection, and a big operations building. So, what is it? What was this thing when we started to build it? In the ACT, we don't do, our Electricity Safety Act stops at the point of attachment or the point of entry to an installation. On everything else is a network under our Utilities Act. We regulate all utilities, water, gas, sewer, street lights, soon to be other things under a separate act. So if it's not a utility, then and it's got electricity, then it's under AS 3000. Originally it was argued that a solar farm is neither. It's not actually an electrical apparatus within the meaning of the rules, was argued with us, because each individual panel only produces 34 volts, and therefore it's ELV, and I have no regulatory oversight. We put that one to bed relatively quickly by pointing out that once you had more than 3 of them in a row, it was going to get over the necessary voltage to start to be a problem. But then you've got the next question. Is this a utility or a piece of utilities type infrastructure, or is it an installation? And why does it matter? If it's built under AS3000, it's going to run to fail. There's no ongoing maintenance requirement. We're just going to say, there it is. If you think about your house, we don't do, or a building, nobody comes and does routine checks on the power points to make sure that they work, or the light switches. We wait till they fail, we replace them. Is it okay to run a generator of 20 megawatts on the basis of run to fail? Strong argument put by the proponent. Well, that's their risk. They're a generator. If they don't generate, that's their problem, not ours. We as a regulator shouldn't care. If it's built as a utility, changes a whole range of things. Don't need electricians to build it. You can operate under a safety and operating plan. You can construct under a safety and operating plan. You still get the standards, but you don't get strict compliance. The proponents chose very aggressively to get it built under AS3000. That decision has a whole series of consequences for everything that happens next. All solar farms have problems of intermittency. The sun goes down, clouds come over, it rains. We understand that. We can pretty well take the averages around what happens. We know the weather patterns. Got 100 years worth of them, we can pretty well tell what's going to happen. But intermittency isn't reliability. So should we be able to regulate for reliability in one of these solar farms? Strongly put to us by others, no, we shouldn't. Not our business. We disagree. But that series of choices on that front page then makes a series of questions, well, who does the work? Who's legally entitled to do the work? We're talking about a system which becomes quite, at one level, is very basic, and another is quite complex. But these issues are issues that we are finding as much in buildings and modern forms of construction as we are finding at this solar farm. So what do you do when you build a solar farm of this size? There's a series of things for the electrician to think about and the electrical contractor to think about. They don't necessarily have to think about elsewhere. The environmental management, it's near a flight path, so they had to check for solar glare. There's flora and fauna all over the place that need to be managed during the construction. Canberra has particularly clay soils. It doesn't absorb water. Runoff becomes a significant issue, both in the environmental sense, but in a practical sense about the actual electrical installation and what constitutes a proper installation and who should be in charge. The choice was made in this vote that the civil contractor was the head contractor. That then meant that there was a subsequent series of electrical contracts let, to which the coordination was left to civil contractors with a lower level of knowledge about what the electrical installation actually was. So what happens on site is you get a lot of product brought in. A lot of product comes from overseas. So we're building under AS3000, 2007. We've got IP ratings, we've got cable selection. And don't forget the temperature. Canberra's very cold. It's much colder than what most people think it's going to be. And this site is, because it's got an extra height above sea level, it's a little bit colder than the rest of Canberra. And anybody working out there knew it. So what you see there on the left is a power conversion block. The right-hand end you'll get 24 1,000 volt DC cables coming in. They go into an inverter that consumes about half it, and the other side is a 11 kVA transformer. When it arrived on site, if you open up and you look at the right, there's something that's obviously not quite accurate in this. They are the mains cables on the 11,000 volt side. Anybody who's colourblind, they are all green. An argument ensued for over 2 months about whether or not green could be used as an active colour. Strangely, this was their solution. That doesn't comply with AS3000. In case anybody was unsure, this comes back to the issue about minimum compliance. The reason they're green is because they don't have halons in them. They're an environmentally friendly cable in Europe. They are widely used in Europe, we're told, and so when 10 of these arrived on site, wired like that, everybody thought we were just being extreme. We won the argument in the end. They've all been rewired. They are all now compliant with the Australian colour code. They aren't compliant with the international colour code. They're not compliant with the European colour code either. You'll also notice there that they use bare copper earth, which was, I was impressed because I can remember starting my apprenticeship in 1983, taking out the last of the bare copper cable that we had. You'll also notice in terms of installation practice that they did have 2 knockouts on the top of the box they're going into there, and they managed to avoid both of them by drilling a 3rd hole, which is common in the electrical industry, particularly with regards to solar for IP56 rated equipment, when it doesn't quite work to drill a hole in the back of it to make it more convenient and thereby somewhat damaging the IP56 rating. Shipping containers move and are twisted in transport. If you claim it to be IP56, if anybody's doing this work, stand inside. If you're using shipping containers, go inside and close the door. Which is when you do this, you'll see that they twisted out of shape. They needed to be reshaped to establish their IP56 rating. Those couple of issues there are about, it's not solar farms alone that you would find that. The lift industry is subjected to it. Lots of product comes in. DRUP units for backup supplies to data centres particularly all have this same issue about the expectation when they arrive that they will be fit for purpose in Australia. They often are not, and the blame and the responsibility for that lies in our regulatory system with the electricians. Now move to talk to you about the issue of engineers. The difference between engineering, we see this widely, in what is drawn and what actually gets installed. So you'll see there, that represents the frames on which the panels will sit. You'll see in orange at the bottom there, the conduits are beautifully swept up. They swept up to the risers that are supporting. The design there is such that the cables will come up, and you'll see from the top photo that the actual metal riser is being used as mechanical protection for the cables that are coming up. That's a solid and useful way to do it. Just above there on the left-hand side is one of the 240 above-ground junction boxes. So, what actually happened with that design? These are the footings. You'll notice the footing on the right-hand side didn't quite make it into the earth. What happens there is that the ground is uneven, but the design was for them to be flat. So where the ground dipped, they didn't adjust, and so you get situations where your footing is sitting on top of the ground. They have to be fixed, obviously, because it doesn't really hold your frames down. The question then is, does that metal frame constitute a part of the electrical installation? Now later on, when it comes to lighting, this is going to become a key issue. At this stage they say no, we're going to run a separate earthing mat, a separate earthing grid, so it doesn't matter. You notice in this one what they've done, there's no bolt to connect the 2 pieces of metal together. So they will move. If electrical continuity is required, we're not going to get it there. Certainly not over a 20-year life. Things to be aware of when you're actually out there looking. Most of these will be built in Australia without anybody looking over anyone's shoulder. It's rare in the ACT. You'll see from the size of the footings before, what happened is that the footings were actually proud of the upright, which meant that that beautiful design of the conduits coming up couldn't actually be expressed. So they sit at least 90 mil, sometimes further, away from the actual upright. Therein lies the solution they came up to in the interim. A couple of bits of timber, some baling wire, sometimes they use building wire as the mechanism. Now you've got a problem because your cables aren't mechanically protected because they're 90 mil away from where they should have been. How many instances have you got? About 240. You'll also notice that because they're upright, they're susceptible to having moisture, so the solution was to shug to fill them up with expander foam. The question we asked the electrical contractor was, what's the foam, what's in it, and will it interact with the cables to deteriorate the performance of the cable? And did you derate for that? To which the stunned silence and Nobody's ever asked us that question before, was the reply. It's not sufficient on the part of the electricians to say, nobody told us, we didn't know, we were following the engineer's instructions, any one of the above. They had to resolve those issues. They got rid of the timber and it wasn't going to last. When you're on site, there's brown snakes, there's the little work health and safety issue to be worried about around this site. Environmental management becomes quite an issue on a solar farm that's out in the open on clayey soils. We had a rain event. A lot of that soil you see there is the sand that washed out, that was the bedding sand for the 4.5 kilometres of HV cable, because when it rained, they weren't ready for it, and it ran out and then ran off site and into known waterways. That gets the environment protection people all over you, as well as some, in this reach, rare, but they managed to even trigger the Commonwealth's Environmental Act, which was quite, as a regulator, they're people I'm scared of too. There was a second rain event that occurred once the panels were actually on. The panels have the effect of concentrating water when it rains. That concentration of water then takes down and starts to take away the supports around the footings across the entire site. So where the water concentrated itself, you started having washaways around the footings. The soil itself, because you're compacting it as you're going along, is making the runoff worse, so you get higher speeds, more water and more damage to what is a part of the actual electrical installation, because everything by now, through issues with how they're going to manage the lighting, that the frames themselves are a part of the electrical installation are now being compromised by the fact there was a failure to manage water. I said earlier that temperature matters. In the ACT at this site, -6 to -10 is the actual temperature coefficient you have to use. You'll see in those calculations just how much the voltage changes when you actually have to put those calculations into the formula. So what they've done, and this is common, and we're building 3 of these solar farms, that the calculations that have been done usually are in the -1 to -5. And as you can see from there, that's on that example, it's the difference between 112 volts maximum and 130. If you're right on the edge because you've got cable that's got a maximum of 1,000 volts, and when this one was first done, they had a maximum voltage rating of 989 volts was what they'd planned to put in at -5. When you do that calculation, you're very close. You're already at a 1% margin of error on getting an overvoltage in your supply. The engineers and the electricians would turn around and say to us, oh, but the engineer said it was okay. Come back to them. The engineer doesn't get regulated, you do. You lose your licence, not them. Underneath what you see there on the right that's underneath one of the power control blocks. So they're that's the DC supply coming up into the end of the base underneath one of the power control blocks. The water is damaging everywhere on the site. It's a very key issue for the electrical installation to be able to manage the water. Now you've got to ask yourself on site, who's responsible? Who is ultimately going to be responsible on a site with this level of complexity? You will get this exact same question in building construction. Who ultimately takes responsibility for things that affect the electrical installation? This lesson has been learnt painfully in the ACT by our fire engineers who do work in buildings and had a default assumption about how the electrical systems would work without ever testing it, and finding buildings unable to get certificates of occupancy because of a failure to actually manage the interaction between the alternative fire solution and the actual electrical installation. When you come to in-ground earthing, various techniques were used. Some of this work got done by civil contractors. How do I know this connection on the right-hand side got done by a civil contractor and not by a licensed electrician? It's been made against the lay of the cable. I'm yet to meet an electrician who would make that mistake, to try and make a join against the lay of the cable. The rule says that any in-ground junction must be impervious to the ingress of water. That's why post-construction, a huge amount of money had to be spent to go back and retro test everything. A significant chunk of the in-ground connections too, because even though the specifications required testing as it was being built, that fell out of the program of work, it didn't get done. And so at the end we say, well, where's your testing regime to say that your joints were properly made? It wasn't there, so many weeks spent digging up and retesting to see whether or not there was problems with the earthing connections all through the site. There's 6.5 kilometres of cable in there, there's a lot of joins. There's at least 4,080 if you're just connecting up the actual risers to each of the apparatus. Equipotential bonding, 16mm building wire used out there. Well, it's not going to survive with its... I doubt that plastic sheet's going to survive 20 years, but it's only there for the purpose of equipotential bonding now. Originally, that was supposed to be the earthing. That was supposed to be part of the lightning protection. It's not big enough to be lightning protection. So in the end, the lightning protection system was abandoned and it has no lightning protection. The panels will be sacrificed, that's allowable, but there then becomes a problem about what you do with the people who are on the site. So now there's a social control agreed by the Work Health and Safety Commissioner that should there be any thunderstorms within a 50-kilometre radius, the site is to be emptied, and people return to the operation and maintenance building, which is great, except then they didn't realise that they now had a lightning shelter and one earth stake wasn't going to cut it. So as of that matter was in fact resolved last week. The engineers' reports came back yesterday and the certificate of occupancy for this site will be issued today. So what did we learn? Design matters, but when you're designing these things, you need to take consideration of all the things that are actually practically going to happen on a site. The engineering and what was required was not fully tested by the electricians who are going to do the work. And they bore a lot of the brunt, the three very separate, by this stage, electrical contracting firms. One putting the panels on, one lot doing the earth, and another lot doing the power control blocks. Everybody dependent on everybody else, but no one coordinating the actual electrical contractors to make sure that if they, for example, bought 24 1,000 volt DC cables into the power blocks, that the power blocks were compliant and ready to be connected. So coordination on a site this big needs to happen. It also needs to happen in building construction, and it is often a problem. When we push those people who are doing the work, and most of these firms have come from interstate to do the work, their industry knowledge about what the rules actually are, particularly when you're combining ELV panels coming into a DC system, then into a HV system, the very thought that you can get somebody, an individual or a group of individuals together who are fully cognisant with everything that they need to do and to bring that all together is something that really needs to be thought about before you start. There's a phrase that we use now, because when we're regulating buildings or anything else, it's popular in the industry to talk about design and construct. Design and construct is very rare. What's really common is construct and design. Let's build it and see what we can get away with once it's actually in place. That then comes down to how present the regulator is and how much risk people are willing to take. It's a pretty simple calculation, really. Small decisions that took place on site had huge impacts. Decisions about whether they're going to use 16mm or 32mm as the equipotential bonding, that was the difference between whether or not they had a lightning protection system or they didn't. The cost was minimal, the consequence is high. The cost at the time was minimal, the consequence is high, and the time it's taken to resolve it clearly has cost more than what it would have done just to change the size of the cable. That's not unique to this project at all. That's very common. Happens in buildings all the time. It's commonly said to us by electricians, we just did what the engineers said. Engineers are not the protection. They provide no protection in our system against what the work an electrician does. They are guidance, but that is all. They do not constitute knowledge that is sufficient to be able to have the electrician sign off, because when the electrician signs off, the electrician is signing off and saying, I take responsibility. And in doing that, all liability transfers to them. The engineers are all care no responsibility, and on this project, on multiple occasions, I'll give you an example. Having known that there was a problem with the lighting, and we needed to see a lighting study for the building that they were going into, the engineers supplied us with their solution. Except they used the lighting standard they used was the lighting standard for the zone substation. It tends not to have people in it. It's a completely wrong standard. Despite having spent a week and taken some days to get it to us, it was still wrong. And it was us that picked it up, not the electricians, not the contractors, not the principals. Even when they know they've made a mistake, they don't necessarily always get what you want out of them. So, what do I think it means for training? Bit of a list here. A lot of people conceive safety as being a thing that happens on the site. Safety here was about the design. What was going to be inherently safe for the people working on it during construction and now post-construction during the operation phase. Safety has much more to do with about how you put it together before anybody takes a step on site. That is absolutely common. Right, that's a lesson that we see across the entire industry. Literacy is vital in this industry. It is an industry governed by rules. It is a very, very difficult set of literacy skills. It is not just normal literacy. This is about legislative interpretation. It's about knowing how the English language works and how to use it, because it does get used. It's a very difficult skill set and it's underdone. We've heard many times about how difficult literacy is and the standards that we see, and we see that across all the occupations. But literacy in an occupation of rules and laws is important. It's also important to engage with those people who will come in those jurisdictions where we do come and look over your shoulder, how we will apply the rules. This is very much about the excellence and how you see people working. Back to the hockey analogy. What are people looking at? What are the systems in place to make sure it works? We don't nitpick our way through it, but people will lead you to heavier and heavier levels of compliance if they clearly can demonstrate they don't understand what it is the rules are or how we will go about enforcing them. We don't go out to ping people, to deliberately go after them, but they do need to understand the philosophy that we have, that any regulator has when it comes to approaching what it is. Rigour on the part of the licence holder is vital. Question and being taught and understanding how to question. So that's, what are you reading? What's in front of me? What should I know? What should I question about what's being put in front of me? I cannot just accept on face because somebody's got a qualification from a university that they are better than me at this. Because the expectation, they don't have to do, whether it be plumbing, gas fitting, electrical, they don't have to, their lives are not governed by a set of rules or a rule book. In fact, when we're intending to regulate engineers in the ACT, very difficult task. When we wrote, one of the electrical engineers that wrote back to us, he said he really loved the idea of being regulated. It's just that he thought being bound by AS 3000 was unnecessary and restricted his freedom to operate. I don't know what he was designing for if he wasn't going to design within accordance with AS 3000. Makes it very difficult for any of that work to actually go somewhere. We hear a lot about competence and competency-based progression. It's not much of a concern for me. We've been on competency-based progression in the ACT. We changed that funding model many years ago. It's on average, it hasn't really changed much other than make the average completion take a little bit longer. But what's really important is knowing what you don't know. We say this to apprentices. A Cert 3 an electrosystems technology electrician is not going to get you to build one of these farms. It's not enough. People need to know their limits and be absolutely aware of what your limits are and how to manage those limits. I'd also say that as complexity increases in both building types and structures and things we're putting together, coordinating with others, that means playing nice with the trades, the other trades on site, is an actual skill. And it's skill that is very, very short on the ground. That ability to work, to know what the other trade or occupation has to do and how they're going to do it so that the work happens consistently across the project. The issue on this site where you saw the civil contractor went in and put in all the footings. He had a copy of the same design, but what he didn't take into consideration was the design and the cost that was going to be incurred because the conduits couldn't sweep up because he put the footings in ahead of everybody else. Huge additional cost, would have been sorted. It's a 10-minute meeting about everybody respecting everybody else on site to deal with the complexity the site brings. Going back to the first issue about safety is combined with this last issue about gender. We remain a heavily male-dominated industry. The building and construction industry is heavily dominated. That impacts safety greatly. Whether we're talking about working with asbestos, working on sites like this. On the odd occasion, men are known to do stupid things. Sometimes because they're showing off, and sometimes because they don't want to look weak, or they don't want somebody to say, well, that really doesn't matter. You know, just harden up, go and do it. Take the risk. What's the chance? Utilities and working in this industry have the same characteristics to them. They're low probability, high consequence. The chance that when you climb up that ladder or you do that connection, that something will go wrong is pretty low. Consequence is extreme. At its end, it's death or serious injury. Men being men and a failure to understand the role that gender plays in this has been one of the fundamental problems of safety. We are having a huge issue with safety in the construction industry in the ACT. 4 deaths in a single year, and statistics showing that we are still 30% above the national rate for injuries in the construction industry. So when we think about these things, we need to think about all the elements that come together to make safety happen and safety work, but also in this site, certain people on the site were clearly the dominant males. They were saying we will do it this way and nobody else was challenging them. And that failure to challenge resulted in significant delays. But I could take you to half a dozen buildings in the city over the last year and tell you the exact same story. So it's not unique to these, it's an industry issue. And I think it's something we need to think about when we're training people holistically about what it is, what the job actually is. I'll show you something that's, in a moment, that was just one of the more amusing things that happened on site because the way it happened. I just want to finish off a couple of things. Utilities, for us, because I'm the we regulate utilities as well as regulate the installations in the ACT in one place. It's supposed to be a boring business. The duller it is, the happier we are. It's not something that should be exciting because it's all steady state. Utilities at the moment is anything but boring. It's highly exciting. We are currently changing the rules. writing a whole new act for technical regulation of utilities in the ACT to facilitate whole types of new networks, to allow things to happen that have never happened before. It's resisted by the utilities, it's not understood by the generators, it's had a huge difficulty in proceeding, but it will set up, in our view, a much more dynamic environment in which to operate and to see clear and concise regulation. Action Plan 2, which is the ACT government's commitment to climate change, has targets for renewables. By 2020, there's a separate piece of legislation that says by 2020 we are to source 90% of our energy from renewable resources. The three large-scale solar farms, of which this one's only 20 megawatts. It's a toy by any international standard, but it's the largest in Australia by 100%. The other one's over here in WA at 10 megawatts. Things you don't know, they grow grass like you wouldn't believe. They attract wildlife like there's no tomorrow, and that will be one of the big issues in the maintenance contracts. Micro solar in the ACT, we're just on 15,000 individual installations. Every single one of them has been inspected. The failure rate still sits at about 17% on average. That's about 3 times the failure rate of anything else in the industry. So despite several years and lots of investment in trying to get people better, it hasn't been. It's down from 89%, so that's a policy shift, but it's nowhere near where it should be. There are tensions between the retail arm of the utility and its networks. What retail wants to do and where retail can see markets and where networks has its traditional and very justifiable conservative nature about what it wants to deal with. Security of supply is key in networks. Utilities, retail is about making sure we've still got market share and money coming in the door. A lot of the national energy market reforms go to the issue of how informed the client is and the nature of an informed client. It's often that the policymakers involved in that lack a real-world experience of what people will do. Time of use targeting, for example, I can tell you that it doesn't matter what the price of electricity is at 6 o'clock on a winter's night in Canberra, I'm using energy. I can triple it and it's going to change my behaviour. I can't have my kids, I can't wait till 9 o'clock to feed the kids, they'll just be killing me. The other thing about networks, and all of them in utilities, is they were unidirectional and they're now multi-directional. And that challenge will continue to be with us for a very long time to come. Now, when you're at school, particularly any boys in the room, you may have used a magnifying glass to burn an ant or two or to start a fire. If you're on a solar farm and you need the sun and you've got a lot of glass, it's important to pay attention to where you leave it, because that can happen. Coincidentally, the registrar was walking along and said, "What are you doing to manage the fire?" And they said, "Oh, it's okay, we've got that all under control." And then somebody yelled out, "Fire," and they turned around. And we're quick enough with our mobile phones to snap a photo of that. That's a simple, it's a cardboard box, it's out in the sun, they'd partially open the box and it's done. So, managing sites, don't forget the basics. Although that was pretty fun. Thanks very much.
Ian Neeson. One of my roles, I'm a member of EL1, Wiring Rules Committee, and we're very surprised sometimes at the questions that come to us from engineers. In the Sydney University years ago, they used to actually come to TAFE to learn about wiring, the undergraduate engineers. And that stopped a long time ago because the professor didn't like teaching them outlaw wiring rules. And we're addressing, in our revision of standards, we're trying to address that literacy and numeracy. With the engineers, you mentioned objection to the wiring rules. What was the real objection for the engineers having to do the wiring rules?
It's, in terms of a regulatory tool, it does limit what they can do and it makes them accountable in a way that they probably don't want to be. It's interesting that across the whole engineering professions in the construction industry, there's a clamouring, like Engineers Australia, this whole desire to be regulated. The thing is that other people sitting around the room while that's being discussed say careful what you wish for, because you really don't know what's coming, and they don't, because it's the holding to account for your design really will change it will have bigger changes than what people imagine. And it's, even defining what an engineer is going to come down to some it's quite challenging work in a policy sense to get across it.